Hey y'all, welcome to this week's episode of Unfit to Print. I'm your host Amber Athey. I'm the Washington editor for The Spectator and a senior Blankley fellow with the Steamboat Institute. This week we're covering the big Democratic distraction, the economy tanking, the media ignoring the attempted assassination of a Supreme Court justice, the Washington Post finally firing its big troublemaker, and finally the Washington Commanders finding a coach for a personal political opinion. All of that is just ahead, but if you guys are fans of this show, please subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and give us a 5-star review anywhere you go. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can check out our tiered subscriber system now live on amberathey.supercast.com. Thank you guys so much for your support, and with that, let's get right into the episode. Last week, the Democrats started their big show trial of the January 6th committee hearings. They're airing them during prime time now. And as we talked about on the show last week, they actually hired a former ABC News president who helped cover up the Epstein story to help them produce and plan this entire primetime show. Well, the ratings are in, and it turns out that voters still don't care about January 6th. In fact, they care about it even less because, of course, it's been a year and a half since that event happened. It was a couple of hours at the Capitol. The vast majority of the people who have been indicted have not been charged with anything related to conspiracy or sedition, and the Democrats have failed to really prove their case that Donald Trump had somehow incited a riot on that day. The ratings have now come in, and apparently only 20 million people watched across all 3 broadcast networks during the primetime show last Thursday. Now, for comparison's sake, the broadcast nightly news shows, which come on around 5 p.m., typically garner 7 to 10 million viewers each. So 20 million combined a couple of hours later, when even more people are watching TV, is pretty pathetic. According to the Washington Free Beacon, a rerun of Young Sheldon on CBS that aired the week before the January 6th show trial actually garnered more viewers than this big deal that the Democrats have made this out to be. All of this really is just a distraction from a multitude of issues, but I think most recently inflation. We just learned that inflation rose 8.6% in May compared to May of last year, which is the highest increase of inflation in over 4 decades. Now the left is already trying to revamp these hearings because the turnout was not what they expected. Today, on Tuesday, the Democrats actually announced that they were going to be postponing Wednesday's hearings to Thursday because staffers were apparently overwhelmed with the amount of work that they had to do. I don't really understand what they could possibly be overwhelmed by, considering, again, they had a year to prepare for this moment. But according to Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren from California, putting together the video and exhibits for the primetime show is an, quote, exhausting exercise for the video editors. I have a feeling that the January 6th committee would be a lot better off if they hired more lawyers and fewer production assistants, video editors, former news producers, etc. But I'm not in charge, thank God. I don't have anything to do with this. But the Democrats are failing pretty miserably. I have a feeling that the hearings Wednesday night were not postponed because staffers were overwhelmed or exhausted with all of the work. I think probably what happened is they realized that last Thursday's hearing was an absolute bust, and so now they're probably starting from the drawing board to figure out new ways to try to get this to appeal to the American public. What's most important, though, besides the fact that this is all a distraction, I think, is that there's been no real new information presented by the left in these hearings. I mean, I went back, I watched a few of the major clips, and really all that we're learning is that there were a bunch of Republicans who disagreed with Trump's assertion that the election was stolen and that there was widespread voter fraud. Well, we already knew this. We already knew that a bunch of Trump staff members disagreed with him. A lot of them got fired or resigned because of it, and a lot of them have already spoken publicly in the past. So this is not new, and this, again, doesn't go to the Democrats' main conclusion, which is that President Trump somehow planned to incite this riot so that he could attempt a coup of the government and overthrow President Joe Biden. Nothing so far, no evidence to this point has made any connection between the former president and the events that occurred at the Capitol on that day. The best piece of evidence that they've had this entire time is that President Trump told his supporters that they should, quote, fight for what they believe in and for his political future. Well, politicians say the word fight all the time. That is not a violent word in a political context. It doesn't mean to literally physically fight people with your hands or your weapons or what have you. That's just something politicians say on the stump. So that was a ridiculous claim from the get-go. I don't know what else the Democrats really have up their sleeve at this point. I feel like they probably would have presented their most salacious information on the first day of the hearings to try to get viewers reeled in, to get them clued into what was going on and to try to make headlines, but that didn't happen. So everything from here on out is going to be even more boring, even more old news than we already knew. And it's just trying to prevent the 8 to 10 million, or 20 million American viewers who did tune into this to think that this is the story heading into the midterms and not inflation, the economy tanking, what have you. Speaking of the economy being in shambles, I have some data points for you guys. This is really bad news. So first of all, the S&P 500 has officially fallen into a bear market. It is down 20% from its high in January, and I am by no means a stock market expert. I don't consider myself an investor. I'm a woman. We don't do that stuff. We let our husbands handle that crazy nonsense. But I do have a couple of investment accounts. I have an account on Robinhood that I like to play around with. And I have logged into some of these accounts recently, and it is very distressing. And for people who are set to retire soon, this is really bad news because you either have to end up delaying your retirement or you take out your money and end up getting way less of a return than you were planning on because the stock market is at historic lows. This is really awful for anybody who has money in investment accounts, and that's not just rich people. If you have a 401k, if you have an IRA, if you have any type of basic investment account, this is big trouble. And that is really the least of Americans' worries. Gas prices have officially hit an average of $5 a gallon. Groceries are up 12% year over year, the biggest increase since 1979. Chicken is up 17.4%. For those who don't know, chicken is the most popular meat that is eaten in America, so that's a big deal. Restaurants are up 9%. Fuel oil up 107%. Electricity 12%, rent 5.2%, airfare almost 40%, and services 5.7%. Not only that, but if you are still working, your wages are not worth nearly as much as they used to be. In fact, they've actually decreased by 3%. Real average hourly earnings down 3% from May 2021 to May 2022. And finally, for food at home, you are looking at a 1.4% increase in May. This is the 5th consecutive increase of at least 1% according to the recent inflation report. So by pretty much every measure, the economy is really, really bad. And there's this meme, this classic meme where the kid asks their mom for McDonald's and the mom says, no, we have, such and such at home. We have chicken nuggets at home. And then it shows the picture of the chicken nuggets at home and they're like frozen Tyson crap. But this is actually a case where food at home is probably not going to be even that much cheaper than eating out at a fast food joint because groceries have increased so significantly. So it's like by any measure that you have, you're making less money and you're spending significantly more. Even these typical savings tricks or tips that you would give to families in order to try to keep some of that money in their pocket are not doing a whole lot when everything across the board has increased in price so significantly. If you listen to the White House, though, everything's fine, guys. Karine Jean-Pierre, the new press secretary who replaced Jen Psaki, was on CNN's Don Lemon tonight, and she said, hey, guys, the economy's in great shape. Look, we have a plan. This is putting us in a good place to have a historic economic boom. Listen to this.
Many economists do cite the war in Ukraine and supply chain issues. We did have that before the war, supply chain issues. They also say that last year's stimulus package, which you mentioned, contributed to inflation, Karine. Does the Biden administration bear some responsibility for this?
So, first of all, the American Rescue Plan met the moment, and it has put us in a place where we can actually put us in a place where the American people feel can actually, we can take on inflation. What I mean by that is we've seen growth, right, with as I mentioned, more than 8 million jobs, and now we're transitioning into a stable growth. The president actually wrote an op-ed to discuss that himself, lay out his plan on how we're going to bring down inflation, and so that's really important. In order to take this on, we got to have be in a good historic economic place, which is where we are right now.
This woman is possibly a worse communicator than Vice President Kamala Harris. The time is now, and now is the time. This is the level of communication that this woman is offering to us. It is crazy. She's gaslighting the American people. She's lying to them. She's repeated this lie several times in press briefings over the past week, claiming that the economy is historically strong. These people really are not only living in an alternate reality, but they actually think that you're stupid enough to join them in that alternate reality, that you are going to believe this nonsense that they are feeding you. But look, now is the time to really buckle down and start storing stuff away, start saving up as much as you possibly can, because it's only going to get worse. And the Democrats and the media, they don't really care about any of this. We're facing increased food shortages as well. We're facing now tampon shortages, which the media is telling us affects all people, not just women. They can't even talk about a crisis without introducing their woke nonsense. That just tells you how divorced from reality these people are. But this is only going to get worse, guys. I'm serious, because not only do these people not care, but they actually view this as an opportunity. For the left, this is an excuse to tell people to purchase electric vehicles. This is an excuse to push the Green New Deal. They want to really catastrophically hurt Americans in service of their agenda. So for them, this is a good thing. Like, they're going to be fine. They have plenty of money. Their jobs are recession proof. And for everyone who actually has to deal with the consequences of this, they're just going to say, too bad, so sad. You should have signed on to our crazy left-wing progressive plan. So buckle up, guys. Bear down. It's going to get really, really tough in the coming months, years, what have you. It's going to be an absolute mess, disaster, and this country is only going to get more divided than ever once people start facing even worse economic harm. Last week, an absolutely deranged left-wing lunatic who was upset about the potential overturning of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court attempted to assassinate a Supreme Court justice, but if you watch the mainstream media, you probably didn't hear a whole lot about it. The Sunday shows this past weekend refused to cover this, including CNN's Reliable Sources, hosted by media critic Brian Stelter, who claims he's trying to hold the media accountable and show people how the sausage is made, but he won't even call out his own colleagues or rival liberal networks for refusing to touch this story. It missed the front page of most mainstream papers, including USA Today. There was no story at all by NPR, which is funded by your taxpayer dollars. ABC's This Week decided that instead of covering the Kavanaugh assassination attempt, that they were going to interview Sandy Hook survivors to push for gun control, and Karine Jean-Pierre for Pride Month to talk about the fact that she is a gay woman. Really important, hard-hitting stuff, guys. If for whatever reason you do watch a lot of mainstream media, I don't know why you'd be doing that and also watching this show, but if that happens to be the case and you want a little recap on what happened, here it is. A 26-year-old man flew across the country from California to D.C., then took a taxi cab to the home of Supreme Court Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was one of the conservatives on the court prepared to help overturn Roe v. Wade. This man apparently got out of the taxi cab carrying a suitcase filled with weapons and various tools for either kidnapping or tying up the Supreme Court justice, saw that the justice's home was surrounded by police officers and various federal officials, went the other way to try to get away from the situation, ended up calling 911 on himself to turn himself in, and was eventually arrested by police officers. This individual admitted to the police that he was there to kill Brett Kavanaugh, both because he was upset about the abortion ruling and because he thought that Brett Kavanaugh might help secure gun rights under the Second Amendment. And this individual also said that they were hoping that this act would help give his life purpose. So I listened to the 911 call of this person, And he sounds pretty calm. He's breathing a little heavily. He sounds kind of upset, but overall pretty calm. And I saw a lot of left-wing people on Twitter responding to this 911 call by saying, see, this is just a guy who was having a mental health crisis and he stopped himself before he did anything bad, and this really is just not a big deal. I read this a little bit differently. I think that this guy got out of the taxi cab, saw that there were U.S. Marshals stationed outside of Kavanaugh's house, realized he wasn't going to get away with this because the marshals apparently spotted him as he started to walk back down the street, and realized that this was kind of a do or die moment. He was either going to try to go through with it and obviously get caught and not succeed, or he could go ahead and call the police and hope that his sentence would be lighter if they caught him and that he would be able to get psychiatric help. So I don't think this was like a moment where his mental illness suddenly became clear and he was lucid and he realized that he was about to do something really bad. Because why else would you be able to plan, probably for weeks, this idea of flying out to DC? He had checked a gun, apparently, on his flight. He had a knife. He had zip ties and soft padded boots for sneaking into a house. This was clearly a very articulate plan. He had clearly spent time on this. I find it unlikely that he finally gets outside of the house, he spots the marshals, and he goes, oh shoot, I just need to go to a therapist because I was going to do something bad. This guy realized he was going to get caught, and so he tried to take the easiest way out that he could see. But regardless of all that, this is one of the most insane attempted acts of political violence that I've seen in a long time. I mean, this is by far the biggest attempt to subvert democracy since probably the Alexandria baseball shooting and the attempted murder of Steve Scalise and other congressional Republicans. Supreme Court justices are not supposed to be swayed by public opinion. They're not elected officials. They're there for a lifetime appointment. And these individuals, these left-wing individuals who have been protesting out of the Supreme Court justices' homes, are breaking the law by trying to intimidate them into changing their opinion. And the media has not only refused to cover that, they've refused to cover the fire bombings of pro-life centers, and they've refused to cover this attempted assassination, which was clearly born out of the encouragement of people showing up at the justices' homes to try to subvert our justice system. This is such an insane oversight, intentional oversight by the media, that even Bill Maher, who is a left-wing comedian, he's not a right-winger, called out the New York Times for burying this story on the 20th page. Watch this.
Point is, I think your point, and the point I would agree with is, the New York Times buried this.
Yeah, it was like a tiny thing below the fold.
If this had been a liberal Supreme Court justice that someone came to kill, it would have been on the front page. And that's what's so disappointing about a paper like the New York Times, because they just wear their bias on their sleeves, and if it's not part of something that feeds our narrative, fuck it.
Why is the media covering this up? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious. They don't want to cover any attempt at political violence by a left-wing actor. This is why they gave far less coverage to the Alexandria shooter, James T. Hodgkinson, who was a Bernie Sanders supporter, than they did the Gabby Gifford shooting, which they conveniently tried to blame on Sarah Palin and later had to retract that claim because that doesn't fit their narrative. The media wants all of the violence to come from the right. They drummed up this Patriot Front story just this past week. There were about 30 members of this allegedly white supremacist group that were planning on interrupting a pride rally. And we recently saw video come out that a federal official admitted on camera that they had infiltrated the group. And so I'm waiting to see how much of this was actually the members plotting a riot, as was claimed in the charging documents, versus how much was actually incitement from a federal official who had infiltrated the group. We saw previously, for example, that the attempted kidnapping of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was almost entirely planned and instigated by federal officials. So I'm always skeptical when these right-wing groups somehow make major news for planning some domestic terror event, because it seems like mostly what happens is the FBI infiltrates and sort of incites these members to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. So I'm withholding judgment on the Patriot Front case. I don't know who they are. I don't know what they believe in. If they're white supremacists, obviously I condemn them. But the fact that the media is hand-wringing over this like group of weirdos over somebody trying to assassinate a Supreme Court justice is really odd to me. And again, it's because they want the right to be the violent group and the left are just like the sunshiny, smiling angels. But in this case, it's even more disturbing because it's not just that they don't want to associate left-wingers with violence, but it's also because in this case with the Supreme Court justices in the protests, these people were actually egged on and encouraged by the Democrats. So they're always claiming there's a link between Donald Trump and what happened during the Capitol riot. There is a way stronger link between the Democrats and this attempted assassin than anything that Trump said during his speech on the ellipse. First example, President Joe Biden promised during his late night appearance on Jimmy Kimmel that if Roe v. Wade did end up getting overturned, we could expect a, quote, mini revolution. Listen to this.
It's clear that if, in fact, the decision comes down the way it does and these states impose the limitations they're talking about, it's going to cause a mini revolution. They're going to vote a lot of these folks out of office.
Yet somehow the White House wants us to believe that they never said any of this. Deputy Press Secretary Andrew Bates released a statement on Twitter claiming that Jen Psaki never encouraged people to protest outside of the justices' homes. He actually posted a transcript of her remarks with the sentence before the one I just played for you guys highlighted and the sentence that I played for you guys not highlighted, and posted it and said, Jen Psaki never said that people should protest outside of justices' homes. Like, are we illiterate or something? Is he illiterate? Clearly he thinks we're stupid. He posted the sentence right on his Twitter account and then insisted it wasn't there. And then Karine Jean-Pierre did the same gaslighting attempt this week when she said that the White House never said specifically where protesters should not or should gather. It's all a lie. And if we go back to 2020, we can find actually the strongest evidence that these Democrats secretly wanted people to go and intimidate these Supreme Court justices into changing their opinion on a whole number of rulings. Because in this 2020 speech, Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer, who is currently the Senate Majority Leader, said in a speech at a rally that Justice Kavanaugh and the other Supreme Court justices who plan to rule against quote-unquote abortion rights were going to unleash a whirlwind and that they would pay the price. Listen to this.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price.
And then you had Jen Psaki, the former White House press secretary, saying during a press briefing that her and the president certainly encourage protesters to show up outside of Supreme Court justices' homes. Even though that is illegal both under federal law and under state law, you cannot picket outside of a justice's home with the attempt to sway their opinion. And in Virginia, at least, you're not allowed to actually show up and protest outside a private residence. But the White House encouraged it anyway. Listen to this.
So I know that there's an outrage right now, I guess, about protests that have been peaceful to date. And we certainly continue to encourage that outside of judges' homes. And that's the president's position.
So how exactly does a Supreme Court justice pay the price when they're not an elected official? You can't just vote them out. They're there for a lifetime appointment. And they're not supposed to be having the public determine what their opinions are. So what other way is there for a Supreme Court justice to pay the price other than have to deal with protesters terrifying their children at night by chanting outside of their homes, or worse, an attempted assassin sneaking around late at night trying to break in and kill the Supreme Court justice? And what is the whirlwind exactly? This is such an absurd statement, and yet you have Democrats in the media repeatedly claiming that Chuck Schumer was just talking about a political whirlwind, and none of them will explain what exactly that political whirlwind would be for, again, a Supreme Court justice that is not an elected official and cannot face electoral consequences. From top to bottom, this is such a clear-cut case of Democrats egging on potential violence, refusing to accept the consequences, and instead actually covering up the event right after it occurred. And it's all thanks to the media's help. Last week, we covered the story of the turmoil at the Washington Post after Dave Weigel retweeted a joke about women being either bipolar or bisexual, and his colleague Felicia Sonmez, who is currently in legal arbitration against the Washington Post, having a public meltdown on her Twitter account. I told you guys last week that I thought Felicia Sonmez was intentionally trying to get in trouble because she knows that the Washington Post can't do anything to her without the threat of retaliation. Well, the Washington Post apparently finally had enough because they fired Felicia Sonmez. She went on a week-long tear on her Twitter account, and it didn't end with Dave Weigel. She went on to criticize the company's enforcement of the social media policy. She criticized her editors. She criticized the paper's owners, and pretty much anything having to do with the Washington Post. It eventually reached a point where she was in clear violation of this social media policy that she was complaining about, and the Washington Post decided to fire her. Turns out it's not usually a good idea to criticize your employer and your colleagues on a public forum. Now, I didn't think that they were actually going to have the cojones to do this because they were going to be worried about the ensuing legal battle. But I think Felicia finally gave them a good enough case where maybe they feel comfortable with firing her for cause. But I think she was trying to get fired because, again, she has this legal dispute over the paper taking her off of sexual misconduct coverage. And she had the case originally thrown out by a judge, but she's currently in appeals. And as I said last week, I think that Felicia Sonmez is trying to get the Washington Post to punish her so that she can claim retaliation in her lawsuit. She's going to claim that the Washington Post fired her not because she broke the social media policy or because she was publicly criticizing her employer. She's going to say that they fired her because they were sick of her lawsuit and they wanted to be able to get rid of her and sweep this all under the rug. So I would stay tuned on this story. I don't think this is the last that we've heard from her. She's actually been quiet on Twitter since she got fired. If you go back and read those threads, though, don't they almost sound like they were written by her lawyers and not her? I mean, a 30-tweet thread breaking down the ins and outs of the social media policy and specific examples of people who allegedly broke it and weren't punished versus people who broke it and were not punished. I think it all seems a little too convenient, and this is clearly, I think, a real legal kind of sneaky thing that she did, and the Washington Post has not seen the last of her. They're going to have to end up dealing with this in court. Dave Weigel, meanwhile, is still on his month suspension. Poor guy. But hey, you make your bed and you lie in it. You work for the Washington Post. You get in trouble for making jokes. That's what happens. You guys know I like to cover sports every now and then, especially when sports intersects with politics. And that happened recently when the Washington Commanders, previously the Washington football team, and way before that, the Washington Redskins, decided to fine their defensive coordinator, Jack Del Rio, $100,000 for expressing his personal political opinion. This all started when Del Rio decided to tweet in response to a Brookings Institute scholar about the January 6th committee, asking why people weren't more focused on the summer of riots in 2020. Well, promptly the media freaked out and they decided to ask Jack Del Rio and multiple Washington Commanders players about his comments. Jack Del Rio initially defended himself, saying that he has a right to speak as an American and he believes in that right and is not going to apologize for what he said. He also said in a press conference, elaborating on his comments, that he believed the January 6th Capitol riot was nothing more than a dust-up, whereas the looting, destruction, and rampage during the summer of riots in 2020 was much greater in terms of harm to the country. Watch.
You want to talk about it? I'd talk about it with anybody. Yeah, no problem. At any time. But they're not. I'm just expressing myself. And I think we all as Americans have the right to express ourselves, especially if you're being respectful. I'm being respectful. I just asked a simple question. Really, let's get right down to it. What did I ask? A simple question. Why are we not looking into those things? If we're going to talk about it, why are we not looking into those things? Because it's kind of hard for me to say I can realistically look at it. I see the images on TV. People's livelihoods are being destroyed. Businesses are being burned down. No problem. And then we have a dust-up at the Capitol. Well, there's nothing burned down. And we're not going to talk about, we're going to make that a major deal.
That specific term, dust up, became the subject of subsequent news stories freaking out about Jack Del Rio expressing a dissenting opinion about January 6th, and Del Rio eventually apologized for using that specific term, saying that it was inappropriate, but said he stood by his comparison to the 2020 summer of riots. But the Washington Commanders were not thrilled with this, and they decided to release a statement objecting to Jack Del Rio's opinion and fining him $100,000 for expressing it. The statement from head coach Ron Rivera said that he was disappointed in Coach Del Rio's comments. He said they don't reflect the organization's views and are, quote, extremely hurtful to our great community here in the DMV. He said what happened at the Capitol was an act of domestic terrorism. Lives were lost and the Capitol building was damaged. Even worse, he went on to say that while Jack Del Rio does have the right to voice his opinion, quote, I want to make it clear that our organization will not tolerate any equivalency between those who demanded justice in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the actions of those on January 6th who sought to topple our government. I think Ron Rivera is right in the sense that there is really no comparison between the Capitol riot and what happened in the summer of 2020, but not in the way that he thinks. Clay Travis from Out the Coverage tweeted out this amazing infographic that shows the difference between the two events. In the summer of 2020, there were 500 plus BLM demonstrations that lasted 7 months and led to the murders of nearly 24 people. Hundreds of small businesses were destroyed, 150 plus federal buildings damaged, $2 billion in overall damage to the country. Over 2,000 police officers assaulted. The protesters were, of course, bailed out by Democratic politicians, and they were encouraged by the media, who downplayed it and said that they were mostly peaceful. Compare that to January 6th. It lasted a couple of hours. There were 0 murders. In fact, the only person who died was killed by a Capitol police officer, and the only injuries that took place were naturally occurring things like heart attacks and drug overdoses. There were no small businesses destroyed. There was 1 federal building damaged to the tune of approximately $1.5 million, 140 police officers assaulted, and yet the protesters have been kept in solitary confinement. They have been held without bail, etc., etc., and we are still talking about it to this day. So Jack Del Rio was right. He was 100% right to ask why the media and these various left-wing individuals are not talking about the summer of 2020 and instead are focusing all of their attention on January 6th. But he was fined for that, $100,000. That's a lot of money. But even his own players stood by him before the organization decided to fine him. In fact, one of his players, Jonathan Allen, said that
defense coordinator's been pretty.
One of his players, Jonathan Allen, said that he respects people having a difference of opinion. Listen to this.
Rio defense coordinator has been pretty active on his Twitter lately. Yeah. Some political stuff that kind of runs counter to a lot of what players have said. Yeah. Does any of that make news in the locker room?
Not really, to be honest with you. Me personally, I stay away from it. I've heard about it, but I don't get on specifically, so I don't have to really answer the question because I really don't know. But in my opinion, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Some guys decide to share it on Twitter. Some guys don't. It doesn't make one person better than the other. And at the end of the day, you can have a difference in opinion and still respect one another. I mean, I feel like that's what our country is about. That's what our team's about. So, I mean, me personally, I don't care about his opinion. His opinion, as long as he shows up every day and he works hard, I mean, that's what I want from my defensive coordinator.
Cornerback Kendall Fuller similarly said that if he had a problem with Jack Del Rio's tweets, he would address it with him privately. But one of the beautiful things about football and locker rooms is that everyone gets so comfortable with each other, and this type of political bickering really doesn't matter. I think it's quite interesting that the NFL and the Washington Commanders have this huge problem with Jack Del Rio expressing a political opinion and fining him to the tune of $100,000, considering Colin Kaepernick was never fined for kneeling for the national anthem, yet somehow we're supposed to treat Colin Kaepernick like some kind of martyr. Then you also have dozens of NFL players convicted of violent crimes who are still playing in the league and collecting millions of dollars from the NFL. People who beat their wives, their pregnant girlfriends, who drove drunk and killed somebody, who committed armed robbery, assault. The list goes on, and yet all of these people still enjoy fabulous careers and have really just faced a couple of games suspension in many cases and are still considered heroes to the general public. So the double standard is absolutely outrageous. And the Washington Commanders themselves have way bigger problems to worry about than one guy having an opinion that happens to be different from the left-wing narrative. Dan Snyder was recently investigated by the NFL for allegedly creating a toxic work environment that was sexist, and has recently even been accused by half a dozen of his cheerleaders of committing sexual assault or sexual harassment. I would think that that would be a bigger story than the fact that Jack Del Rio has a political opinion, but Dan Snyder is never held accountable for his actions. Not only this crazy sexist allegation against him, but also the fact that the Commanders haven't won a playoff game in about 15 years. How about you get your bench in order and start winning games before you fine people for expressing themselves politically? That's it for this week's episode of Unfit to Print. If you guys enjoyed it, please subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and leave a nice review. And if you'd like to support the show financially, please check out our tiered subscriber system on amberathey.supercast.com, and I will see you guys next week.